we are. So as Sarah has already said, my name is Jha D. Amazi, and I am a principal and director here at Mass Design Group. And I appreciate the reference to the full bio, which also indicates that in addition to architecture and design here at Mass Design, I'm also a spoken word artist and community organizer, because I do believe that those parallels, that intersection of my personality certainly impacts the way that I work. And I think it's important for me to say that working at Mass and being at Mass is really one of the first times in my professional career that I've had an opportunity to celebrate both of those aspects. So if folks have any questions about my bio, again, please ask them, put them in the chat, or you can save it for after the discussion. The other thing that I would like to say before I kind of get into sharing some thoughts and ideas is I'd like to offer just a bit of a content warning. And that is to say that none of the images that I'm going to share today are graphic in nature necessarily. However, the topics and the context, particularly as it relates to racial injustice and loss of life, it can be triggering. And so I invite you all to take space as is needed. This is, heavy work. A lot of it is rooted in trauma. So for those of you that do have your cameras on, if you need to take them off, please do so. Or if you need to step away from the computer while I'm talking, I won't notice because your cameras are off, but I really want you all to take care of yourselves through this conversation because it's important to absorb it, but it's also important to be able to reflect honestly on what it means to you. So with that, I just want to offer a little bit of a personal context to this work. And I'll start that by saying, I'm born and raised in the Boston area. So I'm calling you all currently from Cambridge on the other side of the bridge. And my mom lived here most of her life as well. She moved while I was still in undergrad, but she called me back in 2018 when the protests to change the name of Faneuil Hall were making headlines, because she still keeps up with all the headlines here in the Boston area. And she called to ask me if I had anything to do with them. And I responded with a chuckle and, casually said no, but I asked why are you asking me? Why are you calling? And she said to me, well, it's because you've had a problem with Faneuil Hall since you were a kid. And I didn't remember that story. I didn't know that I had this problem until she recalled it for me. And she basically said, during one of our mini trips to downtown Boston, because that's what we would do on the weekends, my mom would take me all throughout the city and we'd look at memorials and parks and museums and et cetera. She said, as a child, we went to Faneuil Hall, to Quincy Market, and I asked her what a Faneuil was in an effort to understand the name of the place, why it was named as such. And she didn't know, so that led us to the library to do some research, which resulted in me refusing to ever go back to the slavery market, which was my reduction of Peter Faneuil being a slave merchant. So once we did this research and we understood that Faneuil Hall was named after Peter Faneuil, who was a slave merchant in the New England area, I started to connect those with the space itself and refused to return. And so my mom says that I was furious as a child and that I, couldn't comprehend why the powers that be in the area weren't changing this, why Bostonians weren't protesting, why this place was allowed to be called that. And so when she recalled this story for me, it made sense to me now that one of the first times that I intentionally went back to Faneuil Hall as an adult was for one of my first spoken word poetry flash mobs, where colleagues of mine and I were actually protesting against displacement and homelessness in the city. And up until that moment, I had not been back to Faneuil Hall since that time as a young child. And so I share that story with you all mostly as a reminder to myself, but also to share with you all that I've long been questioning the impact of public space on our cultural psyche. And prior to joining Mass, I admit that there wasn't much that I felt like I could ever do to answer those questions. I hadn't really yet made the connection between architecture and design to this impact on cultural psyche until I started doing this work in the lab. And to that point, I now have this very clear understanding that the world is a proliferation of symbols that either help or hurt us, which is to say that these symbols, these designs, this architecture, this built environment is never neutral, that it either helps or hurts us. And that the construction of public memory lends weight to very particular narratives, which brings us to ask who and what is deemed important, whose stories are we telling, but most importantly, whose stories are being left out? Who are we neglecting in our public spaces? Whose history is being denied? So the two previous images that I just shared and that I spoke to, they're actually speaking to this larger memorial movement that I would say is happening around the world, where designers, artists, architects, and activists are being called on as spatial experts to create locations of memory that will also serve greater social aspirations and transform our society holistically towards peaceful outcomes. So our public memory and memorials lab here at Mass is a response to that call. And in this work, we are asking ourselves, how can spatializing memory support healing and inspire collective action for generations to come? Essentially, how do memorials counter violence and create peace? And again, I just want to pause for a moment to express a brief moment of gratitude, which is to say that in September of 2017, I had made the decision that I would work for just one more year in architecture. And after that, it felt like 5 years would be enough. And from there, I would retire myself and work full-time in community organizing and spoken word poetry. And the reason for that was because although I was learning a lot, I did not feel like I was actually able to catalyze the change that I wanted to see in any way in the built environment. And that was exhausting me. Later in November, however, of that same year, a friend of mine texted me to say that Mass was hiring and that I should get my application in by the next day. And I was on a deadline. And my response to my friend was, no, I'm busy, I'm on a deadline, and besides, I'm comfortable. And the moment I saw the word comfortable go across my own cell phone screen, I knew I had to apply. Because if I'm comfortable, that means I'm not working. And if I'm not working, if I'm not moving, if I'm not shaking, then really what is the point? And so I joined the team here at Mass in February of 2018. And since then, I've absolutely been overwhelmed by the opportunities, the experiences, and the exposure, quite honestly, to this work. And you'll hear me reflect a little bit on what I mean by that through these projects. But I wanted to share that to say that I almost left architecture, which we can talk about in the questions and answers, because I did not realize that there was an opportunity to lead something like a public memory and memorials lab. So at any rate, I'll go back to this notion about how, or this question rather, of how memorials can counter violence and create peace. And when we say violence, we're specifically naming violence in response to the to the work of the Norwegian sociologist and peace studies scholar, Johan Gunten. And he argues that in order to advocate for peace, we must first understand violence at different scales. So Gatlin's triangle models and articulates these three types of violence. The first is direct violence, which is physical or emotional injury that is inflicted by one person on another. And this violence is personal and its time scale is momentarily. Usually it's referred to as an event of sorts. The second is structural violence, and it is a process created by systems that inflict damage over time. Examples of this include inadequate access to healthcare or housing, and inequities in policing and sentencing. The third is cultural violence, which is perpetuated by one culture against another, and it's usually based on ideological justifications like religion, linguistic differences, artistic or scientific studies. And a lot of times that can be used to legitimize injury in the name of belief in these different systems. To this point, we believe that all memorials act in some way. Some are subtle, some less so, but their effectiveness in creating peace or opposing violence can be difficult to determine. So Gatlin's triangle provides a pathway for analysis for us through our work. Among these memorials, there are typologies that align with the three different violences that he identified. So the first would be memorials that mark. These are memorials that address the direct violence. Then there are memorials that provoke. These are memorials that address and communicate structural violence. And thirdly, there are those that evoke, memorials that address cultural violence. The first category that I mentioned is represented by the Emancipation Memorial here in Boston's Park Square. And it is the most common type of memorial typology that we typically see in our public landscapes. These are physical markers of historic events or people, and they typically take the form of didactic signage or the renaming of places. These are statues and sculptures that are three-dimensional markers, and their power by design is to emit an air of an undebatable historical fact, undebatable. The second category, memorials that provoke, are those that demand a response. They're often tactile, participatory in their nature, and the AIDS Memorial quilt is a striking example of this type of memorial. It demands engagement from the public, namely the contribution of these panels in honor of loved ones who have died. In this way, the quilt is a participatory memorial that again is responding to this cultural violence, if you will. The third category, memorials that evoke, are often more spatial and experiential. A visitor goes on a journey through the memorial, a passage that enables the gradual absorption of ideas. Evocative memorials stimulate the visitor not just to acknowledge the information, but also to act on it. So the National Memorial for Peace and Justice can be attributed to this category. In our work, we believe that successful memorials navigate between the infinite and the intimate, which is to say that they do not all have to mark, provoke, and evoke, but the very effective ones might actually do all three. Through the individual story, we surrender to the magnitude of shared loss. And if in this process we are given the tools to engage, the rituals to enact, the stories to hear, and the spaces in which to hear them, we may find that memorials are active contributors to cultural transformation and thus a tool for peace. So I'll pause there for a moment before I actually start talking specifically about some of our projects and see if you all have any questions about the overall approach or strategy of the Public Memories and Memorials Lab. And as I said before, please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask your questions, or if you want to pop them in the chat, I can read them and respond. Just giving everybody a moment.
Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
I just have one question about, when you were talking about the three kinds of memorials, the third one, I can't remember the name, but you said that they kind of tell a story and people kind of walk through that story. It's the African American Museum. I mean, it's a museum, but would you consider it kind of that kind of memorial? Because when you go to like the basement and you walk all the way to the top, it just kind of tells a story throughout African American history and culture. Like, would you consider that to be a memorial, or?
I think that's a great question, first and foremost. So the third category, just for your reference, are, memorials that evoke, which are the memorials that address cultural violence.
Okay.
And so I would say, while the NMAC is a museum, I think there's certainly memorial aspects to it. And therefore, I think it could be argued that, yes, they are meant to evoke a certain experience and a certain journey, because if you do travel through the museum in the way that it was designed to be navigated, there's certainly a journey and an experiential story to be told. And so I think that argument could be made. I don't know if the design team was, thinking of it in that way, but I think that's a great question. And I would use that as an example for the third category for sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions before I continue? Like I said, this is y'all's conversation. This is your moment, not mine. So feel free to jump in. Okay. Well, if something does come up, please use the chat so that you don't forget your question. And as soon as I see it, I will come back to it. So I will now shift to sharing some information about a few of our projects, and I will begin with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. I don't, show of hands, is there anybody that has visited the memorial already? Whether it's like virtual hands or just saying something in the chat. Seems like none. Just check the chat. No, okay, that's perfectly fine. This is an opportunity for y'all to get an introduction before visiting it. And I do see that there's a question in the chat, so I will address that momentarily. But I will share that our work here with EJI actually began with a cold email that was sent by one of our founding principals, Michael Murphy, to Bryan Stevenson, who is an intrepid and brilliant civil rights leader, a lawyer who fights for those incarcerated, condemned, and imprisoned. And Bryan's work to date had been very successful, but he faced a challenge, and that challenge was, how could he and his organization help people to understand the history of American injustice without being able to necessarily link together the ways in which that injustice or that racism has actually evolved over time? And what I mean by that is, one of the things that Bryan Stevenson often says is that slavery didn't actually end in America, it just evolved. And I'm sure you all have heard this thesis in multiple arenas, but that, it evolved and it became the Jim Crow era. It became the lynching of African Americans. It became the resistance to the civil rights movement. And it also, quite honestly, has become the current state of mass incarceration. And so understanding these connections, Bryan Stevenson and his team was determined to mark every site of lynching in America and essentially document the undocumented, marking locations where African Americans, over 4,000 of them, had been killed and mutilated in public killings throughout the United States between, on average, the years of 1880 and 1945. And it's important to note that other countries, such as South Africa, Germany, and Rwanda, have all built memorials to their atrocities in order to begin a healing process in their nation from injustice, to overcome and attempt to repair these injuries. But America had never done anything like this. Instead, we tend to shy culturally, or in our society, we tend to shy away from apologizing and wrestling with this complicity and the power structures that remain, and therefore leave this work undone. And so Bryan Stevenson wanted to dismantle that, and he needed a memorial to do so. And rightfully, he chose Montgomery, Alabama as the place to site this memorial. And while the reasons for that are many, one such is that there are many markers commemorating the white supremacy of the Confederate South, who we all know lost the Civil War in 1860, but none that acknowledge the Black American experience, none that acknowledge the slave trade that took place throughout Montgomery and the ways in which that impacted the American South, but the American North, the American continent altogether. So Stevenson chose a hill visible from across the city for the site of the memorial. This is the second tallest elevation in the city of Montgomery, so that you could see this memorial. And on April 25th, 2018, we opened the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is otherwise known as the Lynching Memorial, is the way a lot of folks refer to it. And from a distance, upon arrival into the space, it is meant to be a form that is familiar and subtle, something that is evoking a colonnade or pavilion, if you will. And as you enter, you see that these columns bear the names of counties and the individuals in which, the individuals who were lynched in these counties. In some instances, there are full names, first and last. Other instances, there are only last names. Other instances, it says unknown and just the date when this person was lynched. And so the records in some places are relatively incomplete. But as you go further into the memorial and as you start to turn the corner, you experience the ground drop. And these columns start to rise above you, reflecting the hangings that often happened in the public square. Eventually, the ground flattens and the sensory environment shifts with the presence of a water wall, allowing for a moment of pause and reflection. Prior to this moment, there's a wall that you would have walked along that has these plaques that describe all the various mundane, idiotic reasons why some of these individuals were lynched. It just has very simple sentences that says, you know, this person walked too closely to a white woman, or this person, you know, raised their voice at a white store clerk, or something to that effect. And it really is kind of disheartening and, dare I say, disgusting, honestly, to read some of the reasoning behind this. And so this moment of reflection and then this moment of pause is certainly necessary after having gone through that corridor. Before you exit, you're invited into the center of the memorial, and you're invited to stand on, as I mentioned before, one of the highest points in Montgomery, giving you the vantage point to look out through to the city through the lens of this memorial. And it's meant to be another moment of pause and reflection, but also for a moment of hope, to be able to see the city of Montgomery in contrast to this wrought history. But outside, there's a second chapter of the memorial that appears, and you can see here in the bottom right center, or I guess it's the center of my screen, duplicate markers that are identical to those that are hanging above you in the landscape are laid, that are hanging above you in the pavilion are laid out in the landscape. And these identical markers are meant to be requested by and acquired by the counties that are listed on them. So the counties are invited to embrace the truth of their history and claim their markers, so that over time, the memorial grounds actually become a visual representation of national healing. It becomes a visual representation of who and where is willing to have these conversations around racial reconciliation and claim this marker. And so the markers are meant to be erected in the public squares, in front of the city halls, in front of the old courthouses, where historically a number of these lynchings would have taken place. And like I said, over time, the landscape will transform and become a visual representation of who is prepared and willing to have some of those conversations. I'll also add, and I'll bring up a slide of this later. I apologize, I don't have it in this deck, but prior to starting this work of the design process with Brian Stevenson and his team, we actually launched an engagement strategy. We wanted to see how many folks we could engage, how many people as possible we can engage. And so we thought of the simple act of collecting soil from every site of a lynching victim across Alabama, so that each of these individuals had their own urn of earth, if you will. And so EJI gathered a team of students, community members, descendants, and more to participate in this engagement. And now every jar of soil in Alabama has been collected. And if you do take the trip to Montgomery to see the memorial, and you also go down the street to the Legacy Museum, you can actually see these jars on display. So before we end here today, I will pull that photo into the deck so that you all will have an opportunity to see it. Before I move to the next project, I want to pause again and see if anybody has any questions or clarifying points for me about the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And I admittedly prefer to keep some of these slides relatively short and straight to the point, because for us, for all of us, it's important that you have this experience for yourself. And so when folks have not been to the memorial, I don't want to overwhelm with too much information, because I want you to kind of experience it for yourselves and then invite me back for another conversation about what it is that you saw and you felt and you experienced. So I do still am more than happy to answer any questions, though, if folks have them before I move on to the next project. Okay.
Well, there was the question in the chat, but you might want to answer that at the end because that's not directly related to this.
Yes. What about the possibility of memorials being vandalized? How do you think about that? Okay. So I'll actually answer this now, and I'll move the chat so that I can see it. The question asks, for those that can't see it or maybe are looking at the recording later, is what about the possibility of some memorials being vandalized? How do you feel about that? And what measures are taken to prevent or stop that? So I'm going to answer the question kind of in reverse order, which is to say, you know, measures that are taken to prevent or stop that. It depends on the project. In some instances, the materiality that we're choosing, the paint, the finish is vandalism proofed, or I can't think of the right term, but it's essentially like a materiality that won't necessarily receive certain markings and painting and et cetera. Or if it does, it can be very easily cleaned or very easily buffed off. I think how I feel about it is complicated, because oftentimes when I do see some level of vandalizing or, you know, some sort of marking, that to me is a response, and it means that at least someone is seeing this work. Whether they want to admit it or not, they're thinking about this work, they are reacting to this work, they are providing an opportunity to generate conversation through this work. And so while it is completely disrespectful and unacceptable, I do see it as generative in a way. There are a number of murals, art projects, sculptures just here in the Boston area that I've seen vandalized over the years beyond, you know, me doing this work, where it provided an opportunity for activists or artists to pay closer attention to our public landscape in a situation where they otherwise might not have had to, or, you know, friends of or protectors of this particular memorial, this particular mural have been created in response to say, okay, this thing was installed, this thing was erected, and then as a community, we kind of neglected it, we kind of forgot about it, and this is how it ended up being vandalized. What if we actually were curating events around this particular piece of work and paying more attention to it, using it in our daily conversations, pointing to it more often, you know, for our youth and for our elders and et cetera, and thereby demonstrating to a broader community that we actually care about this. And if you do vandalize it, we're going to clean it up, and we own this. This is part of our memory. This is part of our landscape. So I feel like it can be generative, like I said, albeit disrespectful. The possibility is always there. I remember when I first joined Mass, the design team for the National Memorial for Peace and Justice actually had that at the top of their minds. What if the memorial is broken into? What if the exterior wall is spray painted on? What if people come into the memorial with markers and they start writing on the corten steel? What are we going to do then? And I think what's been remarkable is that in the now 3 years that the memorial has been open, nothing has happened. I think the story, the impact, the experience has quite honestly superseded any level of vandalizing intervention to date. Maybe that'll change over time. The other, of course, response to that is that there is a security guard that is present for this particular memorial, and there are docents throughout the memorial. So as you as an individual are walking through, there are folks that are placed there mostly to answer your questions and to guide you through your experience, but of course to monitor the space, because I think everybody understands that the potential for vandalizing is always possible, unfortunately. So hopefully that answers your question. And if it doesn't, feel free to clarify. Okay, you're welcome. Seeing no other questions, I want to move us along.
I had a quick question.
Yes.
To interject here. I was just wondering, so I was in the kind of the earlier parts of the slides with the slaves that were chained together. And, you know, the rest of the memorial seems very symbolic, but that's obviously a very graphic or direct depiction of like Black trauma. And so I was just wondering your opinion on kind of these images as we are getting more people who are able to bring out this representation of trauma. How do you feel it'll affect the Black community re-witnessing this trauma? I'm not necessarily, I think it's important to have it. I'm not saying that it's not necessary, but I want to hear your opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm actually going to go back to the slide just so that everybody, there we go, knows which slide we're referring to. So first of all, I appreciate your question, because what I did not say, and this is in part because I want folks to go and experience it themselves, is that there are several sculptures in the landscape around this project. So this is not the only sculpture that one encounters through their journey. And the purpose of these sculptures is that they tell a story or a version of a story about the African-American experience from departure from the African continent all the way up until today, modern day. And so the various sculptures that are on the site are meant to depict different times within that. And I'm being very vague because I really want you all to go and visit and then come back and ask questions. To answer your question, though, about how I feel it is responded to by the African-American community, I think the trauma can be both overwhelming and enraging and disheartening, but it also can be a call to action in a way. It also can be a reminder of the work to be done. I actually just got back from Montgomery and from Mississippi this past week. I had 3 different site visits. So I was in Montgomery, Mississippi, and then Memphis. And so I had a chance to go back to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And I was there with loved ones. I was there with family. And I said to them, I said, you know, sometimes even in the work that I do, I find myself forgetting how close we still are to slavery. You know, how close, how recent this history was, that there are folks still living amongst us who can tell us stories about what it meant to be an enslaved person, what it meant to be a person impacted and subjected to sharecropping and convict leasing and slavery and et cetera. And I was like, and we wonder why we are currently or constantly in these protests and in these riots and in these movements and in these pushes to change the systems that are currently impacting us, because the history is so recent. It is still in and of us. And so these visuals, while they are harsh and they are hard and they hurt, like physically you walk up to this and it hurts. It is also somewhat jarring enough to remind me I still have work to do, right? I still, as turned off by this as I am, as much as my stomach hurts, I still have work to do. And so I do think it is it's a difficult place to navigate. And sometimes I think presenting these images like this with no context, with no sense of hope, with nothing to do, with nowhere to go with that anger is one thing. That to me is just traumatizing and re-triggering. But to do this within the context of a broader story, within the context of a broader memorial, with then, you know, the hope that visitors will go now to the Legacy Museum and interact with EJI, I think that is a call to action in and of itself. And so it depends on the context in which these traumatizing images are represented, I would say.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, I am going to move to the next project. There's one more project that I want to share with you all in full. And then there are a few projects that we're working on right now that are on the books that I will share with you all. How I'm going to do that all in like 15 minutes, I don't know, but we'll figure it out. And then we will continue with questions, and I can stay a little bit longer if other folks can. And if not, you all can always reach me with questions via Sarah, and I will respond back. But it was at actually the opening for the National Memorial for Peace and Justice that we met these two intrepid women, Pam Bosley and Annette Nance Holt. They are the co-founders of an organization called Purpose Over Pain. It's based in Chicago, and it is an organization that the two created in response to having both of their sons taken due to gun violence on separate occasions. And so they reflected on how powerful of an experience the memorial was, and they essentially asked our team, challenged our team to say, what would it look like to create a memorial to victims of gun violence and to this gun violence epidemic? And so for those that aren't aware, gun violence in America is staggering. In 2019, the rate of gun violence deaths had increased to about 100 per day, which is an average of 700 a week, which is over about 3,000 per month. And the unreal perspective is that about 44% of American adults report knowing someone who has been shot, which is to say that this is an issue that affects all of us. And in doing so, truly does make America a nation of gun violence. And while these numbers are powerful and shocking for the public or the policymakers, they are also somewhat abstract, and they flatten the individual into oversimplification of points of data and endless spreadsheets. So the question for our team emerged: how do we tell the story of the vastness of this epidemic without losing the beauty of the individual life? How do we capture, as I had mentioned before, both the intimate and the infinite? And so to answer that question, we looked back to a project that accomplished this in the late 80s, and that is the AIDS names quote, that I referenced a little bit earlier in our lab thesis. And so during the height of the AIDS epidemic, when politicians were fighting over treatment and researching and demoralizing the communities that were impacted, activists developed the idea of the quilt. And in that, they asked loved ones to create a single square that was dedicated to those who had died due to the AIDS epidemic. And then the squares were assembled to tell a story of love, but also to tell a story of loss of life. So their dignity was preserved, but combined together, they tell a national story of negligence and, quite honestly, political failure. At a certain scale, this message becomes impossible to ignore. Covering the National Mall, this project is both temporary and profoundly spatial. It deals with the sense of the infinite, and it takes death and all of its misunderstandings and contradictions to fight for policy change in the future. To be both a number and a human being, to be an agent for change after we are gone. And so for Pam and Annette, we thought about a similar approach, a grassroots campaign where we would create a national conversation by asking any family member of a gun violence victim to reach out to us and contribute an object on behalf of their loved one, a token, a memory, something that reflected the passions, the personalities, the interests of their loved ones. And we invited folks to meet us at these object collection events across several cities, including Chicago, Boston, DC, Miami, Detroit. There's so many more that I'm listing, but we asked folks to meet us at these events to contribute their objects. And for us, it was yes about receiving the object, but it was more so about being able to sit across the table from these individuals, sit across the tables from these family members and hear their story, have them reflect to us why they were willing to participate, why they were contributing the object that they were contributing, and so forth. And I'll say that theoretically, I understood what we meant by a living or participatory memorial prior to this work, but it really wasn't until I was sitting across some of these tables that I could actually feel the power of this project. I witnessed these everyday objects be transformed into a talisman of narrative shifting, of truth telling, and of celebration. And I was quite honestly overwhelmed and grateful for the bravery of these families to step into this space. And a lot of them reflected for me that the experience in and of itself was cathartic. For some of the moms, for example, it had been the first time that they had stepped into their child's room in order to find what object they would want to contribute to this memorial. So we gathered these objects, these artifacts, and we housed them individually within the bricks of the glass houses that you're seeing on my screen. And we chose the house as a form because it is both familiar, but it also represents the domesticity of this issue of gun violence, which is to say that, there's a number of gun violence victims that unfortunately are shot and killed in their own home. Actually, one statistic says that 2/3 of gun violence deaths are suicides, and actually 70% of that 2/3 are older white men living in rural areas. And so we wanted to be able to bring in this conversation about the domesticity of gun violence, to bring it home, to have people to reflect on what it means for gun violence and gun violence prevention, gun violence safety, to actually be a conversation that starts in and of the home. So we collected these objects and, as I mentioned before, installed individual objects in each brick. And on the brick, we inscribed the name of the loved one as their family wanted it represented. We also included the year of that individual's birth and the year of their death. And the types of objects that we received really are a reflection of how many different types of people are impacted by gun violence. I think the composition of seeing these different objects represented in the houses certainly revealed to me a different narrative than what is often presented rather on our nightly news. And what it also told to me is that while we, the design team, had provided the framework for which this memorial could be built, ultimately it was the families who were willing to contribute an object that actually came together to build this memorial. It was their stories, their visual representations that actually told the story. So we piloted this project at the Chicago Architecture Biennial in 2019. So this photo and the photo that you see previously are the houses situated in the Chicago Cultural Center. And at the close of the biennial, we were invited to exhibit the houses at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., which is currently where they sit until September of this year. And we continue to work with local organizations across the country on object collection events. To date, we've collected roughly 800 objects, and our goal is to continue collecting thousands of objects to eventually fill these bricks and to take the project all over the country and create a memorial, a temporary memorial on the National Mall. In the end, the best we can hope is that the lives that have lost are given the space that they deserve, and that their numbers collected can help us heal as a nation from one of our greatest injustices. I'll also add that on the bottom left-hand slide, you can see a video screen here. And so every place that we exhibit the houses, our goal is to have a multi-sensory experience, whether that's audio or visual, where we're also relaying back to the visitor some of the stories that we've heard from these families during the object collection events. A lot of times folks sat across from the table from us, told their story, and were willing for that to be recorded. And so you can hear people explaining why they contributed the object they contributed, or why they contributed to the memorial at all, why they think this work is important. And so I invite you all again to take a trip to DC, to see this exhibit at the National Building Museum, and of course, to come back to me if you all have any questions. So I will pause here one more time before I very quickly let you all know about 4 to 5 other projects that we're working on in the lab. And then of course, before we just open it up more generally for conversation and reflection.
I have a quick question, Jha D. I'm curious, how did you organize the objects? Or is it arbitrary, or is it chronological? Is it by area?
Yeah, it is curated carefully, which is to say, the first round of objects, if you will, were placed at eye level within the houses. We evenly distributed them across all 4 houses. We kept spaces in between them. And we only put two objects next to each other if the two individuals were related, because one of the things that we did not anticipate was that mothers would be coming in with two separate objects for two different children. Cousins would be coming in, or, related folks would be coming in with two cousins, unfortunately, that had died at the same time. And so we wanted to be able to communicate through the memorial that these individuals were related. As the memorial continues to grow, really, we're working on maintaining sightlines and making sure that people can read the information, that like 2D flat objects are not placed too high or placed too low, and so forth and so on, so that visually every object can be absorbed. They are intentionally not ordered in like a chronological order. They're not ordered by location, because the goal is to be able to create, dare I say, randomness in it, so that people can actually understand how everybody and anybody is impacted by gun violence. And so if somebody just steps into one house and they only see a certain amount of years, or they only see representation from what they assume to be one state or one location, then the narrative is lost. So it was curated carefully, randomly, if that answers your question.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else?
Did you guys build those? Did you guys build that with the intention of it being exhibited or moved around, or like was that kind of spontaneous?
We knew they would have to move because we knew the biennial was temporary. We did not know when we first built them where they would move to. And so this is the moment where collaboration with other experts makes a lot of sense, which is to say that our fabricator, this place called Rosenwood Studios, they were very instrumental in telling us, this is how we're going to build these houses, so that when you do have to pack them and move them, they are easily able to do that. So each house can actually come apart in 4 parts. The corners are intact because the corners are the most vulnerable places. And so they didn't want the corners to be disjointed. And the roof structure is assembled as a whole. And obviously the glass comes off. And so they took care of the fabrication in such a way that it could move fairly easily. It gets packaged in boxes and can transport. So we knew we would need to move it. We just didn't know how many times or where. And we're actually in the process, very early process, at early stages of starting to design the next iteration of the houses so that we can test what it looks like to place them outdoors. Because these currently are only an indoor condition. We could never place these outside and still protect the objects. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. Okay, so these next slides, y'all, I'm gonna try to do 30 seconds per slide. So you're probably very much gonna have questions based off of how quickly I'm going to go through these, but I wanna share them with you because I want you to understand that there are a number of projects that are underway within the Public Memory and Memorials Lab. And if you continue to check our website, or maybe a year from now, I can come back and give y'all an update on where we are. But I think it's just helpful to see some of the other work that we are working through and have been inspired by. So the first project is in Harris County, which is Houston, Texas, where we're working with Precinct 1 on creating the Harris County Remembrance Project, which is a 3-city block park that is dedicated to art and social justice, particularly through the lens of criminal justice reform. If anybody's familiar with the Texas area, or Houston specifically, or downtown Houston, it is actually like the center of their criminal justice infrastructure. So there are a number of courthouses, incarceral facilities, jury pool rooms, et cetera, all concentrated in this one area. And so being able to break that up, provide a public space for reflection, but more so for a conversation around the potential for art and justice to come together to the end of criminal justice reform. is currently work we're working on. We are very early in the process. We are pretty much in concept phase, and we're developing opportunities and starting to identify what our community engagement process is going to look like and who the key players need to be at the table for actually realizing a project of this scale. I'll also add that Harris County is one of the first counties that has applied to receive their duplicate marker from the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and they have been approved by EJI. So part of this project is to find a place and design a place rather for the relocation of the Harris County marker. And so you can see here where it says lynching memorial marker on our slide is part of this work. Also in Texas, about 35 minutes southeast from Houston, we're working on the Sugarland 95 Cemetery and Museum. So back in 2018, the Fort Bend Independent School District was constructing their new James Reese Technical Center, which you can see in the background of this photo. And one of the construction workers found what he believed to be a bone. So he paused, put the bone aside, and kept digging. He found a second bone, and at that point, he alerted his team and said, you know, I'm finding bones. I think we need to pause. Luckily, the entire construction team adhered to that and heard him. And long story short, the remains of 95 individuals who have since all been confirmed to be African-American victims of convict leasing were discovered on this land. And so we are working with this independent school district to revitalize the cemetery. You can see on the right-hand side, there's a very simple single chain fence that currently outlines the cemetery. It might be a little hard to see, but there are some granite markers that currently indicate where the individuals were discovered. Not very clear to the naked eye that this is a cemetery, that this is a memorial cemetery. And so we will be working with the school district to create the space that is appropriate to honor these 95 individuals, but also to serve as an outdoor classroom, if you will, for the school district to be able to educate more broadly on convict leasing, the impact that it had on the development of Sugarland, Texas, and more importantly, the impact that it had on the whole United States. For the museum, we will be expanding on that information, working with a local organization called SOJACE, which is community-based, and they are actually working to reflect the work of the gentleman you see in the top left photo. His name is Reginald Moore. For the 10 years leading up to this construction project, he had been doing research and advocating for the fact that there must be mass burial grounds all throughout Sugarland, Texas. Given the fact that there are some existing marked cemeteries, he kept saying, we have to be more careful through our construction processes. There must be more mass graves. There must be more individuals out here, you know, that are victims of convict leasing. We have to do our due diligence. And so when these 95 remains were discovered, Reginald Moore was one of the first people that the school district reached out to. And so he has a lot of information and research that the Museum and Educational Center will reflect on. Unfortunately, Reginald Moore passed in the summer of 2022. And so a lot of the community organizers are doing work in his honor and in his legacy. Here in the Boston area, this is the last project I'm going to share with you all before we open it up. But here in the Boston area, we're working on the Embrace and the 1965 Freedom Rally Memorial Plaza. We are working with artist Hank Willis Thomas, and our project partner in this is King Boston, which is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to telling the story of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, mostly from the perspective of the time that they lived and loved together here in Boston. And so one of the first things that Hank said when we all sat down as a design team, Hank is the artist, the sculptural artist. One of the first things he said is, I want to make sure that this is about love. A lot of times people underestimate or undermine the love that is necessary to do work around civil rights and reconciliation and racial reconciliation. And he says the Kings wouldn't have been able to do what they did if not for love. And so he was inspired by a photograph that the Kings took the night that MLK received the Nobel Peace Prize. And he says in that photo, it looks like Coretta is actually holding him up. And so he wanted to capture that embrace. And that's why that sculpture is referred to as the Embrace. And he also wanted to kind of step away from some of the marking that y'all saw in the earlier examples of memorials that I was explaining, which is to say that a lot of times we focus on the physical representation of the individual and less so on their acts. And he wanted to step away from that and get away from the heroism of a lot of our sculptures. So it's very intentionally abstract, and again, is meant to focus on their love and on the embrace rather than on the individuals and their likeness. The plaza that surrounds it, the 1965 plaza, is to honor the individuals here in the Boston area who were part of the civil rights movement and actually who marched with MLK from a historic church in Roxbury to the Boston Common during the 1965 Freedom Rally that took place in the city. And so it is an opportunity for us to bring in the names of local heroes while also acknowledging this international and national couple. So I'm going to stop there because I feel like I have given you all more than enough information. And if there are, like I said, specific questions about those 3 projects, I know they were very rapid fire. I can certainly provide some clarity to that end. And I will stop sharing momentarily just so that I can better see folks.
Can you see the chat, Jha D? There's one question from Chris Brown.
What were the buildings you used to demonstrate 3 different types of violences? I'm sorry, Chris, can you clarify your question? The 3 different buildings? They weren't.
Do you mean the 3 different projects? So you have the memorial, the quilt memorial, and then the lynching memorial.
Got it. Understood.
You're wrong.
Got it. Yes, I can post those in the chat for you right now so that you have them. There we go. So this is.
I'll just say while you're doing that, Jha D, that was a really beautiful presentation. I found it just really inspiring and in some ways very positive. And in light, kind of uplifting, which is kind of odd. And my studio in landscape architecture, my 4th studio, we're looking at a Quaker meeting house in Easton, and right now the students are doing a campus plan for them, and the students have been charged with looking into the historical and kind of community context of this particular Quaker meeting house and in the town of Easton. And a lot of the students have kind of gone on taken off on this underground railroad and history of slavery and the history of Quakers and slavery, and it's just been really kind of revealing and inspiring and a complete unknown part of the project. And so a couple of them are here. 3 of my students are on this call right now, and I just be curious to know what you know about Quakerism and just kind of the racial divide between religions and races on the Eastern Shore, if anything.
I'm going to be so brutally honest with you all on this live YouTube recording.
Yeah, it's fine.
Say that my knowledge of Quakerism ended in elementary school after those history lessons. I don't have an extensive current cultural reference to it, particularly here on the Eastern Shore. But I do have a number of contacts that I could put you all in touch with if that is helpful to that end, because there are a number of people who I have encountered through this memorialization work and also through some of the other projects that I did not share with you all, where we're asking the questions about the impact of religion on our public spaces. And, by way of those conversations, I've certainly come across some folks that might be helpful. So if you remind me via email, I can get you in touch with some folks.
I will. That's excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Actually, may I contribute something? So Sarah, I have this book. I know you can't see it, but it's called Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, Quakers, African Americans, and the Myth of Racial Justice.
Where'd you come up with that?
That's timely.
We did a project, a transdisciplinary project for the Harriet Tubman Byway. many years ago.
With Paul Voos, that's right. Didn't
Yes,
you?
with Paul Voos.
Okay.
So if you want to borrow this, I can. It was written by two African American women and their take on the Quakers and racial justice. So
Yeah, that'd be perfect. That's brilliant. Thank you.
sure.
Look over there. Ask and you shall receive.
Right.
I had a quick question about the Freedom Rally Memorial that you showed. My name is Llewellyn Means. My question was, how do you go about selecting artists, and how did you know he was right for that job?
Yeah, that's going to take a while to answer. It depends on the project. There have been 3 projects now that I've been involved with where we needed to select artists. And on the other 2 projects, we deferred to our project partner. So we're working at Gallaudet University on the Louise B. Miller Memorial, which is a woman who sued the University of Gallaudet in 1952 so that her Black deaf son would be able to attend school in his home state. And so she won, and eventually they were the first 23 Black students to attend the school. At any rate, we needed a sculptor for that. And so what we did is we selected a list of artists that our project partner could review. And we shared with them that artist's thesis, their way of working, their mission, who they were, why they were working in this artistry, what their background was, as well as a few samples of their work. Our project partner then distilled that down to 3, and then we had interviews with those artists and so forth. So we're doing a similar process on another project that we're working on here in Boston, which is at King's Chapel. However, for Hank, we started the Embrace competition. It was a design competition that King Boston launched. It was an international design competition. And we started that work very soon after the Gun Violence Memorial Project, which we also collaborated with Hank on. So that one was mostly based off of a personal relationship where we said, hey, this competition is coming up. Would this be something that you'd be interested in submitting with us on? But I think knowing Hank's work and having reviewed the way in which he processes the Black American experience through this abstract visualization, and knowing that for what we would have wanted to produce for this design competition, we would want it to be in contrast to some of the more typical sculptures that you see throughout the Boston Common. We kind of just knew that Hank would be our best partner in that work. So it was a smart inclination on our part to reach out to him.
Okay, is that generally the process of selection, is kind of like curating that list, and then I guess you just go back and forth with your partner until you
yeah, because you want to make sure that you're talking through it and you're thinking about it. Sometimes there's one person who's just perfect based off of whatever the topic is or the content is. You're kind of already familiar with that person's portfolio, and so you have an inclination. And other times it's important to compare and contrast and to be in conversation about it to see who is a good fit. So, but yes, normally it is to develop a list, review it, and then talk through it with our project partners. Because it's also about relationships and how that artist is going to work, not just with us, the architects, but also work with the community and, with the other consultants and with the project partners themselves.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Hey there, it's E. I especially loved your presentation. Boy, oh boy, it did a lot for my soul, and it's very inspirational. I'm particularly curious about this project you have going on. You said it's in concept in Harris County, working with the Criminal Justice Department. I'm very curious how you go from working with the victims to how do you integrate, or how did you go about integrating? Or also, I guess I'm curious, did they seek you guys out, or did you seek them out for some type of remediation? And how that process is working with the police department directly?
Great question, and I'm so glad you asked it because I would hate for others to have misunderstood what I said. So I'm glad I have this opportunity to clarify. We are not working with the police department or with the criminal justice department. We're working with Precinct 1, and by Precinct 1, that's the county. So that's Commissioner Rodney Ellis. Precinct, I realize, usually makes people think the local police station, and that is not the case. So we are working with Commissioner Rodney Ellis and the larger, broader Harris County through this project. And they did seek us out because they were working in collaboration with lawyer activist Alec Karakastanis, who was instrumental in the bail reform effort and push that was happening in Houston, Texas. And so while the commissioner's office was working on this project to redevelop, the first block of what you saw on my screen in order to create an environment to receive the marker, Alec said, hey, you should reach out to Mass Design Group. They might be able to provide some other ideas, some other concepts, even talk through the reclaiming of the marker, given the fact that we worked on the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Where the conversation of criminal justice reform comes in at is that we see that landscape as an opportunity to work with artists like those who are already working through the Ford Foundation or the Vera Institute of Justice. We see that as an opportunity to work with artists to have a conversation in the public landscape in a place that is as tensioned as Houston is, with all of these, like I said before, courthouses and incarceral spaces within, a 9-block walking radius. It's a place to open up this dialogue and talk about criminal justice reform and the need for it, and how art can intersect with some of the more politically charged conversations to help a broader audience understand exactly what is happening in our criminal justice system, and to articulate it in a way that helps people to understand how people are being impacted by it and create a sense of empathy that's then necessary to create the cultural change that allows for the political change. So it's something that we're advocating for. It's something that we're looking to create. But like I said, we're still in very early concepts. So that's why I had one slide to share with you all about that project. But thank you for asking, because it is an important clarification to make that we're not working directly with the police department on this project.
Got you. I appreciate that. I definitely found that interesting because that piece of land, specifically going and setting up shop on the land that is their land, seems just like an interesting place to start the conversation. So best of luck on that one.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions from folks? Okay. Well, if there are questions that come up or things that you all think about after today, please send your questions or comments to Sarah, and she will email them to me, and I will be more than happy to provide whatever feedback or context or other resources that I can.
Great, thank you so much. This was really a wonderful presentation. I know everyone got a lot out of it, very inspiring, and I'm thrilled to be in touch with you, Jha D. So thank you for giving the time today, since I know you've been kind of flat out all week. It's only Tuesday.
I did have a quick question real quick before you go.
Okay. Yeah.
A couple, actually. One, could I get you guys' emails or contact information in the chat, please? And two, when you were talking earlier about the Montgomery, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. So I think you did a really good job on the presentation with kind of showing what the memorials are about, and it made me want to go see them. So when I do go, and you said we could have another conversation about like after and everything, do we still get in touch with Sarah to have that conversation?
Yeah, what I typically suggest, because as y'all can imagine, there are a number of times where our team has the opportunity to make these presentations with folks. what I typically suggest is a follow-up, right? Like after more folks have had some time to visit some of the projects that I've talked about, or just visit other memorials, you know, communicating that back to your deans and your professors and instructors and et cetera, and saying, okay, like we have questions, where's mass? Let's bring them back. I find that to be, again, very generative and creates an opportunity for a dialogue. So I think going back to Sarah, even if you're no longer in her studio or whatever, I'd be more than happy to kind of schedule that revisit 6 months from now, a year from now, when I have more to share and y'all have more to share. I think it's good to keep it up, because having these like one-off conversations, I don't know that we all learn as much from each other as we possibly could.
Thank you.
That's making me feel like we need to do a Morgan field trip to around, you know, and we should be doing it over spring break. That'd be perfect time, which is next week. So that's probably too late, but definitely in the works. But yeah, no, I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to be in contact with you, Jha D. And I think, you know, Mass Design Group is a great, great resource and a great outlet for Morgan State students, both architecture or both undergrad and grad students. So
Yeah.
It's fantastic. And just to let you all know, we have spring break next week, so there won't be any lecture on Tuesday. The next one is March 22nd at 4 with Eleanor Sharp. So check your emails and the lecture poster for more information on that. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. And I'll be in touch with you, Jha D. Thanks a million.
You're welcome. Thank you all for the attention and the great questions. Talk soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.